My speech is going to be on the evolution of vampires in literature. So, when you hear the word vampire, what do you imagine? There were monsters, Victorian aristocrats, even misunderstood love interests in some of these stories. So, tales of vampires have actually existed for several hundred years, with the first literary mention being from Heinrich August Ostenfelder's 1748 poem, The Vampire. Although oral stories of blood drinking creatures have existed far earlier than this, I like to concentrate on just popular novels in this speech. So, as an avid reader of fantasy, science fiction, and horror, I can attest to the continued cult like interest that vampire themed stories garner to this day. So, as we look at some of these tales, we can see how vampiric themes have evolved over time. So, we're going to look at three of these stories for the next few minutes to demonstrate what I mean. We're going to start off with the most well known, being Dracula by Bram Stoker. So, Bram Stoker's Dracula is an epistolary novel, which means it's read via letters or news articles. And it was a novel that was published in 1897 as a gothic horror novel. Excuse me. So this novel was very well received at its time, and an anonymous writer said that Bram Stoker was the Edgar Allan Poe of the 90s, meaning 1890s, of course. Though the public received it so well, there were some critiques to be found regarding the inclusion of so much horror in the Victorian era. So we continue to see renditions of this character through film adaptations. The character Dracula has been included in many, many films, some of the most popular being Nosferatu, Dracula featuring Bela Lugosi, Dracula featuring Christopher Lee, Bram Stoker's Dracula featuring Gary Oldman, and the character Dracula in the animated film Hotel Transylvania. So, Dracula's influence can be seen in many more forms of entertainment, including Sesame Street, a cereal brand, Lego, and several video games. And my personal favorite, which is Pesquet's Parrot, which is nicknamed the Dracula Parrot because he is magnificent. So the next novel I would like to discuss is Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. So this is her original novel cover, and this is from the 1994 film, Interview with the Vampire. The Interview with the Vampire is another epistolary novel in the gothic horror genre, and it was published in 1976, and it's an example of how the perception of vampire has evolved. So Rice's novel was met with mixed reviews. You either loved it or you hated it, and there were reviews from critics stating that it was rich in sensory imagery, and then others calling it suckling eroticism, which you can see the example of from the 1994 film here. Regardless of the opinions of professional critics, Interview with the Vampire has sold 8 million copies as of 2008. It has a movie adaptation and also several spin-off movies based on individual characters from her books. So Rice's characterization of vampires is different from other popular novels because she made her vampires less monstrous, more relatable, more human, and more physically attractive, obviously. Rice's novel also addressed the idea that immortality is actually a terrible thing, whereas in other novels it was just sort of touched on as one of the vampire's superpowers. Rice pointed out how it could be a bad thing. So the last novel, unfortunately for us all, is going to be the Twilight novel by Stephenie Meyers. So Twilight is a young adult fantasy romance novel, and it was released in 2005 with subsequent books being released annually until 2008. So why in this instant did the book gods forsake us? So whereas Dracula and Interview with the Vampire were both lengthy, fleshed out stories with very interesting characters, Twilight lacks the lore and depth needed to do vampire kind justice. Laura Miller, a critic, said it best whenever she was quoted saying, "The characters, such as they are stripped down to a minimum, lacking the texture and idiosyncrasies of actual people." Regardless of the lack of horror in this book, it is in fact the scariest book on the list and has been critiqued for normalizing, promoting, and idealizing abusive relationships, and meets all the National Domestic Abuse Hotline criteria for identifying abusive relationships. This is that criteria. This is their website. And this is also some local resources if you identify with any of these things. So, despite the negative feedback on the book, Twilight became a phenomenon and brought vampires back into the proverbial light after roughly a decade of not very much vampire lore. So the series spent a combined 143 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And in 2008, the series as a whole took the top 4 spots on the USA Today's year-end bestseller list. The Twilight phenomenon also bleeds into other types of entertainment. It had a successful movie series. They're still present at Comic-Con. They have their very own TwyCon. There's a Forks Festival every year. There's toys. There's all kinds of things that still make vampires very lucrative business to this day. So, although there are other fantastic vampire novels that I did not get to mention, we'll stop there with the 3 most popular. So, through the speech, I've explained how vampire tales have evolved. We've looked at classic monster stories, the humanization of tormented souls, and we even looked at problematic books that still thrive in the vampire base. So no matter what type of media you prefer, I hope you have something that you enjoy personally and that you can escape into.